In this video, I'm going to introduce you to something called the order of operations. This is an important principle in arithmetic and also for implementing arithmetic in code. You will also see the importance of spacing and parentheses in Python. In particular, you will learn that spacing is important for visualization, whereas parentheses are important for grouping terms together. Now, I'd like to begin with what seems like it should be a really simple arithmetic equation. 4 plus 3 times 2 minus 1 equals, well, what does it actually equal here? There's, in fact, multiple ways that we can interpret this equation, and the answer that we will get will depend on how we interpret these arithmetic operations. So, for example, we can interpret this equation by grouping together the 4 and the 3. So we can say 4 plus 3 equals 7 times 2 minus 1 equals 13. And even here we could break up this ambiguity. We could break up this equation in even different ways. So here I'm grouping together 7 times 2 is 14 minus 1 is 13. But I also could have interpreted this differently to say 7 times 2 minus 1, and 2 minus 1 is 1, times 7 is 7. So we could have even gotten a different answer here. Here's an alternative way to interpret this equation. We can say 4 plus 6, and now the 6 comes from grouping together 3 times 2, minus 1 equals 9. And again, here we can also group the 4 plus 6 to be 10, minus 1 equals 9, or 4 plus 6 minus 1, which is 5. And in that case, they both end up being 9. And there is yet another way to interpret this equation. We can group together 2 minus 1, and that gives us 4 plus 3 times 1. And the answer here would be 7. And again, this also happens to work out to be 7, regardless of whether we say 4 plus 3 is 7, times 1 is still 7, or 4 plus 3 times 1 is 3, and then plus 4 is still 7. So it turns out that the correct answer here to this equation is 9. This is the correct answer. Now, how do I know that it's this answer and not this or any of the other possibilities? Well, the answer comes from this thing called the order of operations. And the order of operations is a sequential list of which arithmetic operations take precedence or priority over other arithmetic operations. So here's the order of operations. We first prioritize parentheses, and then exponents, and then multiplication and division, and finally addition and subtraction. So that basically means that multiplication takes precedence over addition. And so that's why we group these two, or that's why it's correct to group these two terms together, so 3 times 2, instead of grouping 4 plus 3. So 4 plus 3 addition is further down the list compared to multiplication. Now, this might seem like it's a really weird list and hard to remember. And that's why people have come up with memory tricks or mnemonics to remember this order. So you can remember PEMDAS, that's PEMDAS, or some people have converted this into a weird sentence and say, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. Okay, so the order of operations, PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, that tells us that we should group together these terms, because it's multiplication, over addition and subtraction. Now, that's why this is the right grouping here. And the question is now, how do we know that it's supposed to be 4 plus 6 grouped together and then minus 1, and not 4 plus and then group together 6 minus 1. Now, as I mentioned, in this particular example, it happens to work out the same way, both interpretations. So here, the way that the PEMDAS order of operations works is that it's really, the grouping is really, or the order is really parentheses, exponents, multiplication, and division are kind of treated the same. and addition and subtraction are kind of treated the same. So when you see addition and subtraction, it's not necessarily the case that addition always takes priority over subtraction. Instead, if you see addition and subtraction, then you interpret them left to right. So the correct grouping here would be 4 plus 6 gives you 10, and then minus 1 equals 9. And that's because in terms of PEMDAS, they are, addition and subtraction are kind of equal, but we read this from left to right. So we interpret this first and then this. So for example, the same thing would be if it were multiplication and division. So for example, if this were 4 divided by 3 instead of 4 plus 3, then we would have division and multiplication here, and then we would actually interpret the 4 divided by 3 first because we're reading left to right over here. All right, so now let's switch to Python and we will see how this gets implemented. And in particular, I want to show you that parentheses takes precedence, takes priority over all these other operations. And this is something that we will utilize in code to basically override any order like this. The first thing I want to do is confirm that without applying any parentheses, I'm going to be able to reproduce the answer that I claimed was correct in the slide. Because it's one thing for me to say that some mathematical equation is true, but it seems much more convincing when a computer does it. So let's say print, and I'm going to say, so that was 4 plus 3 times 2 minus 1. All right, so now we get 9. And now I would like to show you that spacing actually has no effect whatsoever. So when I wrote it out here, I put spaces between each number and each operation. But I'm going to say 4 plus 3. And then with spaces everywhere else. Maybe I'll even do it here as well. 2 minus 1. So now when you as a human look at this line of code, what you see, what your brain is doing is grouping together the 4 plus 3 and it's grouping together the 2 minus 1. And those are separated by multiplication. So in your mind, you might be thinking that this should now be 7 times 1. However, when we run this code again, we still get 9. So the point here is that spacing is really important for humans, for you looking at your code and for other people to be able to interpret your code and read your code. However, the computer, Python, doesn't care about spaces. You can have as many spaces as you want, like this, and Python is going to completely ignore all of these spaces here. However, we can override everything using parentheses. So remember, parentheses was the first order of operations in please excuse. So now I put 4 plus 3 in parentheses, and now, okay, I'll get rid of a little bit of this spacing, it's a bit excessive here. Okay, so now we have 4 plus 3 times 2 minus 1. So now we get a different answer, and let's see if we can figure out why we get this answer here. So this comes because we say 4 plus 3. Now this gets grouped together, so this is 7. And now what gets grouped over here? So we still have the multiplication. So actually Python is grouping together the 7 times the 2. So this gets run next, and 7 times 2 is 14. And then we say minus 1 is 13. So again, we can override this by adding parentheses here. And now we are really going to get an answer that is consistent with the visual grouping. So now the answer is 7, and that's because this gets grouped together as 4 plus 3 equals 7. These get grouped together, and the 2 minus 1 gets evaluated first, and that's 1, of course, so 7 times 1 is 1. Here are your 2 exercises for this video. What you see here is 2 exercises, and each one contains 4 numbers and 3 arithmetic operations. And I also give you 2 answers here. So what you need to do is write these expressions, write these equations into Python. Actually, not the whole equation, just the first part, just the left-hand side of this equation. And then figure out a way to add parentheses to make the following equations true. So you need to add parentheses wherever appropriate to get this first expression equal to 2 and this second expression equal to 0. So now is your opportunity to pause the video, switch to Python on your own, work through these two exercises, and then when you're finished, you can come back and watch me solve these problems. Okay, so let's add a new cell here. And let's start with the first one. So let's see, that one was 4 times 5 divided by 7 plus 3. So if we just run this on its own without any parentheses, then we get some answer. It's 5.85 whatever. This is definitely not equal to 2. So that means that the default order of operations is not going to give us the right answer. We need to add some parentheses. So there's essentially two ways you can go about solving this problem. One is you can just kind of randomly poke around and add parentheses wherever you feel like. You know, maybe here, and okay, that doesn't change anything. But that's not necessarily the best way to go about solving problems in math or in programming. A better way is to sit down and first think about what the answer should be. Now, in this case, we have only 4 numbers and 3 operations, so it's not so hard to try to do some mental grouping, mental arithmetic. So I know that the answer needs to be 2, and so looking through this, I can see 4 times 5 is 20, 7 plus 3 is 10. Okay, so we want to have an expression that equals 20 divided by 10. So it's pretty clear that we need to group these together. And then the question is, do we need to group the 4 and 5 together? Or can we just leave it like this? And to think about that, we can write down the PEMDA. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And so here you see that multiplication comes before division. So that means that Python is going to group 4 times 5 together first, and then it's going to apply the division. So that means we don't actually need parentheses here in order to get the correct answer of 2. Now, this is already the correct answer. However, if this were my code, I would do a few other things. I would remove these spaces here so that it's really clear, not only to Python, but also to humans who are looking at this code, that this is grouped together in the denominator of this fraction. Secondly, I would also remove the spaces here, also just to make it clear that the 4 and 5 are clearly grouped together as the numerator. Okay, and now if you like, for additional readability, you can add parentheses to the numerator here. Notice, I'm going to run this code again, that doesn't change anything because multiplication already came before division. However, I think you will agree that with the parentheses in the numerator, it just looks a little bit easier to parse compared to without the parentheses. All right, so that was the first one. Let's now try for the second one. That was 9 divided by 3 plus 6 minus 1. And somehow we have to get this to be equal to 0. And it is not equal to 0, it's equal to 8. So again, one thing you could do is just kind of, randomly poke around and start adding parentheses here and there and see what happens. But I don't think that's really the best strategy. A better strategy is to just kind of look and be inquisitive about this problem and see if we can figure it out in our heads. So this is 9, and then divided by 3 plus 6. So if we group these together, we get 9 divided by 9, which is 1, and then minus 1, and that'll give us 0. So I'm going to put parentheses around here. Again, unnecessary spaces, but this helps visually group. And then we have a question of whether we need to put parentheses around all of this to make sure that Python will say 9 times 9 minus 1, as opposed to 9 divided by 9 minus 1. And the answer is we don't need parentheses because, again, division comes before subtraction. So I believe that this will give us the right answer. Again, this is technically correct. If you like to remove some spaces to group these things together, then that's great. I definitely encourage that. So in this video, you learned the mnemonic, that's a memory trick, for the order of operations. That was PEMDAS, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And I also highlighted the importance of spacing in Python for ease of visualization, and parentheses for actual grouping in code.